says it has handed over Russia-linked ads and other records to special counsel Robert Mueller after his office obtained a search warrant for those things. Joining us now to talk about where the investigation is former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti. He believes this is the most significant development in Mueller's Russia probe since the FBI raided Paul Manafort's home last month. Mr. Mariotti, thank you very much for being here. Tell us why this Facebook development is so big.
So up until now, what we saw was Mueller taking a look at fairly narrow areas. So he was looking at, for example, whether Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn had lied on disclosure forms. We knew that he had some sort of tax investigation because he had engaged the IRS criminal investigations unit. We knew he was looking at obstruction, which is actually a fairly contained thing, you know, whether or not Comey was fired for improper reasons. And now for the first time, Bob Mueller is investigating individuals from Russia. He's investigating whether foreigners made contributions illegally in a U.S. election. And so for the first time ever, we could see an indictment that has Russian people and Americans in the same charging document, the same indictment. To me, that's pretty shocking and that's pretty big news.
And the fact that apparently a search warrant was involved is also something of significance, you believe.
For sure. So what that means is the fact that a search warrant was involved means that Bob Mueller had to gather evidence, put it in an affidavit written by a federal agent, and present it to a federal judge. So you literally had a neutral third party, a federal judge, who decided that there was good reason to believe that a crime had been committed and that evidence of that crime existed on Facebook. So it's not just, you know, well, Bob Mueller's looking at this or decided to take a look at it. It says he's already got evidence. He's closing in on foreign individuals who tried to undermine our elections, and he has enough evidence to convince a judge that he should get a search warrant.
But
it's pretty
just to be
significant.
clear, I mean, when you say that we could see foreign names and American names on the same charging document, you mean that people from Facebook could be charged with a crime for taking money for these ads?
I don't know. So let me explain that. I don't know who in the United States, if anyone, was involved in helping the Russians. You know, maybe no one, maybe they did it all on their own. But if you know about criminal activity and you help to make it succeed, you're guilty of aiding and abetting that crime. And so given that Bob Mueller already has evidence of a crime that occurred on and through the Facebook servers involving foreign nationals, it is not inconceivable that Americans could get caught up in that. And really, this is the first charge, or I would say the first thing that he's looking at in this investigation that suggests that we could see that sort of charge coming out.
Because collusion, as you well know, is not a legal term, right? Collusion is a word we've been using for some months right now. But if there were Americans somehow involved with the Russians who you say, you know, may be breaking the law here, that connection would put them in legal jeopardy. One of the things that people have been asking, you know, Facebook, Russia used Facebook to place these ads. How did they determine the analytics? How did they determine where to run the ads? How to target them? Was that information provided by any American?
But you should join Mueller's team. I think those are very good questions, and I think those are questions that people on Mueller's team are going to be asking. You know, we have heard, like you just said, we've heard this term collusion thrown about. It doesn't really mean anything legally, but what I just talked about, aiding and abetting, that does. And same with conspiracy. Conspiracy is when you agree to commit a crime. You don't have to know about every aspect of the crime. You don't have to know everyone involved. But if somebody here in the United States agreed to be part of this in some way, they are criminally liable. And so, you know, the time will tell what Mueller finds. But as you point out, there's a lot of digital evidence that Mueller could look at, like, for example, the targeting information in terms of how to target these ads. He might be able to match that up with communications and show that Americans were helping Russians target those ads. Obviously, I don't know. I'm not part of Mueller's team, but for the first time, we could see a path to that happening.
Renato Mariotti, thank you very much for giving us your legal expertise here.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to do the good stuff next.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
I'll be leaving.
All right, each day we move closer to the deadline for so-called dreamers to be deported unless Congress acts. Our next guest is one of the most outspoken immigration advocates in Congress. He has used very strong language to express his anger at the administration over their treatment of Dreamers. Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Luis Gutierrez. He is a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Great to see you, Congressman.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's go back in time to September 5th. That's when the president announced that Dreamers would have to go unless Congress figures out some sort of protection for them. You were so angry on that day that you lashed out at the chief of staff, John Kelly. Let me read what you said that day. General Kelly, when he was head of the Homeland Security, lied straight to the faces of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus about preventing the mass deportation of Dreamers. General Kelly is a hypocrite who is a disgrace to the uniform he used to wear. He has no honor and should be drummed out of the White House along with the white supremacists and those enabling the president's actions by just following orders. A lot's happened since then. Do you regret speaking that strongly and criticizing John Kelly?
Let me just say this. I could have been more careful with the use of my words. There are times that you need to reevaluate. Having said that, I saw him as head of Homeland Security deport grandmothers who had been for 15 years reporting dutifully to Homeland Security with their American citizen grandchildren. Heartless actions and increasing deportations against people who presented no threat. He said to me, not further than this distance, I'm the one that's stopping the Dreamers from getting deported when he was head of Homeland Security. I care about them. I'm defending them and protecting them. And then he goes and becomes head. And it was a pretty heartless thing to do. So yes, you can always be more careful. And I will probably be talking more about that in the future. And you can choose your words more carefully. But having said that, it really hurt. It was really painful.
But
I think that we need to set a standard for everybody to move forward on.
But instead of blaming President Trump, you blamed John Kelly because he had spoken directly to you. I mean, why lash out at John Kelly? And why bring his military service into it? I mean, since he's so celebrated for that.
Let me just say this. I didn't look at him in terms of his military. What I looked at is a politician, somebody who had gone to work for Donald Trump. I mean, I sat there and I thought, hundreds of Dreamers are serving in the armed forces of the United States, sacrificing their lives in defense of this nation. Thousands of members of our transgender community, many of whom have given up their lives in defense of our nation. Where was he? He wasn't speaking about those men and women in our military service and families that have become under attack. Attack why? And so I thought of 800,000 young people. I meet with them every day. It is a painful situation to watch what they go to. Again, can you use words more carefully? Certainly you can.
John Kelly responded to you after you said that about him. He then put out this statement. This was about a week later. As far as the congressman and other irresponsible members of Congress are concerned, they have the luxury of saying what they want as they do nothing and have almost no responsibility. They can call people liars, but it would be inappropriate for me to say the same thing back to them. As my blessed mother used to say, empty barrels make the most noise. Obviously, he was directing that at you, but we've advanced since then. Since all of this, between you and John Kelly, then President Trump had the meeting with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi where it sounded like they hatched a deal to protect the Dreamers. Do you think that's going to happen? Are you heartened by what you've heard?
Here's what I think. I think that Donald Trump took an action against 800,000 of our youngest, most vulnerable people. And the American public should understand something about the 800. They've been through a security background check, not once, because they have to do it every 2 years. Many of them have done it 3 times. As they've submitted their fingerprints, they have absolutely no criminal background, and they're going to school, they're paying taxes. 91% of them are working. So I have school teachers, I have doctors, I have engineers, I have people at all facets. But most importantly, I have people who are moms, too, of children, and their wives and husbands, and they shouldn't be used as political fodder by Donald Trump. When he kept saying, and you can find Donald Trump saying throughout, well, first I was going to get rid of them, but now they're good kids. I'm going to do, remember he used to say, I'm going to do something real special. Real special? You have 6 months. And if you read very clearly the statement by the White House on that, they said, you've got 6 months to get ready to leave.
But
the only country Most of them, no.
But is this going to happen? Is Congress and whatever Nancy Pelosi and Schumer have done, are they going to save these folks?
Great question. Here's what I think. As you watched and I watched, they passed the budget, the continuing resolution. They lifted the debt ceiling, and we did the hurricane relief. 90 Republicans walked away. That means today their operating majority is 152. They cannot pass a budget. They cannot increase the debt ceiling. They can't do anything moving forward. And as we all know, that budget and debt ceiling vote was 90 days.
Yeah.
So that means sometime before Christmas, we're going to have to go back. And all I am saying is the following. I am not going to go back. And I am encouraging Republicans, and I will suggest to you, a majority of members of the House in the Democratic caucus clearly will not vote for a CR, will not vote to increase the debt ceiling unless something happens, which is 800,000 visas for those
Unless you
dreamers.
protect the dreamers, you're not going to vote on a continuing resolution.
Why? Look, they're in the majority. It's their budget. They run the White House. They run the Senate. They run the House. You want to have a budget? Do your budget. You don't want to protect dreamers? Then do your own budget. Look, part of the Democrats' responsibility is to be an opposition and to take when they attack our LGBT community, to stand up for them, or when they attack women and reproductive rights, and in this case, very vulnerable dreamers.
Okay, we'll see what happens over these next months. Congressman, thank you very much for coming in to share your thoughts on this. John.
All right, Allison, thanks so much. Dozens arrested overnight in St. Louis as protesters react to the acquittal of a police officer in the shooting death of a black suspect. We'll have the details next.
Let's run this by BDO.
Donald Trump will make his debut at the United Nations this morning with a big address to world leaders tomorrow. What will the president say? Here to discuss, someone who has been there, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Mr. Prime Minister, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
So President Trump's been to Europe. He has spoken to European leaders, addressed the world before a few times, but this is his first time at the United Nations. His previous speeches, he was sort of greeted with side-eye, curiosity, maybe some scorn in some places. What does the president need to say this week?
I think it's quite an important moment because this is the first time the world as a whole will be looking at the American president, hearing him. And I think there needs to be clarity, consistency in the American approach. And, you know, people want always the same thing from America and from its president. They want to know that America's strong enough to stand with its allies and to stand up to its enemies. And therefore, I think what people will be looking for today, tomorrow when the president speaks, is an idea of what are the principles that are going to guide American policy, and is there clarity and consistency around those?
Are there those things right now? Is that lacking?
I think there's a mixture of sort of curiosity and anxiety, but this is not totally unnatural when you get a new president coming in. However, I do think this is a very important moment. There's so many challenging issues in the world today, not least obviously North Korea, but people in Europe will want to know, is this alliance still strong? People in the Middle East will want to know where America stands on the issues of the Middle East today. And I think if people get that clarity of message, that will be great. But that's what they'll be looking for. They want to, you know, America's the most powerful country in the world. What everyone wants to know is, where does America stand and where do they stand in relation to them?
And of course, I mean, in terms of uncertainty, there's the latest terror attack in London. And sadly, it wasn't the first this year. I think there's been 5 terror attacks. We have a list of all of them. I don't need to remind you, of course, of some of them, but just horrible ones. I mean, obviously, van attacks, the bridge attacks, you know, also the Manchester Arena bombing at the concert. What's going on in London? Is there something, are there lessons to be learned here? Is something failing?
I think there's a lesson to be learned because it's happening all over Europe and indeed all over the world. You know, one of the things my institute does is actually track day by day terrorist incidents across the world. There's literally not a corner of the world, apart from perhaps South America, where this isn't a daily occurrence. So the question, I think, is the thing I would focus on is, obviously you take security measures to defeat those who are planning violence. But I think the deeper question is, how do you defeat the ideology of this radical Islamist, you know, idea?
What's the answer to that?
The answer is, I think, that you've got to weed out those elements that are promoting this, whether it's on the internet or those people who are giving messages to people, turning them into these types of people who are engaged in violent acts against our way of life. And I think this needs to be done on a far bigger scale than we have at the moment.
This is how President Trump first responded to the latest terror attack in London. He put out a statement on Twitter. He said, "Another attack in London by a loser terrorist. These are sick and demented people who are in the sights of Scotland Yard, must be proactive." This is how the current Prime Minister, Theresa May, responded to the president's statement. Listen to this.
I don't think it's helpful for anyone to speculate on what is an ongoing investigation. It is necessary for us to look, as we are doing, at whether our police and security services have the full capabilities, the powers that they need. Of course, we review after any incident that takes place, and we have had, sadly, a number of terrorist attacks in the UK.
So put yourself back in 10 Downing Street. Had you been Prime Minister at the time that President Trump put out that statement saying that these two people, these terrorists, were in the sight of Scotland Yard before apparently having the evidence in front of him, what would your reaction have been? How would you have felt?
Well, I think I agree with what the Prime Minister's just said. Look, in the end, by the way, the most important thing for us is not what anyone's tweeting about it, it's how we actually deal with it. And you should know that we are foiling plots the whole time. And so is, by the way, virtually every other European country. And this is why I say to you, you've got to deal with this at a security level, but then deeper down, you've got to be asking yourself, how is this ideology and the violence that comes with it getting transmitted, particularly to younger people worldwide? And that's a whole other question with a whole other set of policies attached to it.
Well, look, President Trump thinks that the answer is a stricter, bigger travel ban. I mean, he believes, if you believe the rhetoric around his travel ban, that if you prevent people like this from coming into the United States, that we'll be safe here, and that there has to be a better way to prevent the people like the teenagers who just pulled this off in London from even coming into your country.
Yeah, but you see, part of the problem we've got in the UK and other places in Europe is often you've got homegrown people that are engaged in this.
Yeah, here too, by the way.
Yeah, so of course you've got questions to do with borders and security, and these are very important questions. But I really do believe the deeper question, I mean, right now, for example, around the world, you have millions of young people being educated in religious madrasas, in very strict terms, dedicated to an ideology that preaches hatred against those that are different. Now, if you've got that going on in the world, yes, of course, you've got to protect yourself by security methods, but in the end, you've got to be rooting out that type of education and that type of propaganda. And this is where, obviously, the internet's also very important. One of the things we work on in my institute is how you manage to stop these types of messages getting through to people. When they go onto these sites, you divert them onto sites that are more positive. But this requires, frankly, a revolution in approach way beyond anything we've done so far, because otherwise, I'm afraid this problem is going to grow.
And again, you talk about your institute, the Institute for Global Change. Do you feel like you're swimming, against the tide right now when nationalism seems to be the trend?
Well, I think it's important we rediscover the importance of international engagement. I mean, one of the things we're doing this week is looking at that whole group of countries across the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa. Poor countries, exploding populations, weak government, extremism rife. Unless we're supporting them now, they are going to be a source of future terrorism, of waves of migration that are going to destabilize our societies further. So, my view is we need a completely different, much more radical, much more far-sighted approach to dealing with this than we have at the moment.
And if people want to learn more, they can go to the Institute for Global Change and find out all the things that you're working on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Great to have you here,
It's a pleasure.
Mr. Blair. We're following a lot of news this morning, so let's get right to it.
Very important week for the president. The world will be listening.
If the United States has to defend itself in any way, North Korea will be destroyed.
This is probably one of the most serious national security crises we've faced.
President Trump calling North Korea's leader Rocket Man as he prepares to address world leaders for the first time.
He's a disruptor. He enjoys engaging on social media.
Rockets we ought to probably not laugh too much about because they do represent a grave threat.
Even as people try to recover from Irma, there is more hurricane trouble on the way.
Tracking 2 hurricanes in the Atlantic.
The storm is expected to strengthen as it gains more steam.
This is New Day with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your new day. It is Monday, September 18th, 8 o'clock here in the East. Chris is off. John Berman joins me. A very busy Monday.
Oh, yes.
So let's get right to it. All eyes on President Trump at the United Nations as he prepares to address world leaders for the first time on that stage. Much of the focus will be on how the president explains his America First agenda and his past skepticism of the UN.
North Korea's nuclear threat looming large over the annual gathering. U.S. officials warn Pyongyang that time is running out for a peaceful solution. U.S. bombers and fighter jets again today conducting drills over the Korean peninsula. While that's going on, we're tracking 2 hurricanes posing a threat to the Northeast and the Caribbean. We have this all covered for you. Let's begin with the meetings at the United Nations. Michelle Kaczynski is there. Michelle.
Hi, John. You know, foreign delegations have been talking about this speech even days before it happens. They want to know, is this going to be President Trump on his best behavior? Is he going to stick to a script or not so much? And they want to see what is his tone in addressing them. Is he going to be supportive of the UN without criticism? And how is he going to articulate U.S. foreign policy beyond what they've already heard in the tweets, in the America First, and in multiple mixed messages? President Trump, now home in New York, but about to face the UN, a body he has sharply and repeatedly slammed.
The United Nations is not a friend of democracy. It's not a friend to freedom.
Where now he will also seek more cooperation to face the world's biggest problems. The president set the stage with a Sunday tweet storm, referring to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un as Rocket Man, and retweeting a video edited to show him knocking over former rival Hillary Clinton with a golf ball. Members of his administration out in front of cameras with more tough talk on the North Korean nuclear threat.
We don't have a lot of time left. If our diplomatic efforts fail, though, our military option will be the only one left.
Was the president's fire and fury remark an empty threat?
It was not an empty threat. I'm perfectly happy kicking this over to General Mattis because he has plenty of military options.
At the same time, though, the U.S. has been aggressively calling on China and Russia to do more to choke off Kim Jong-un's resources. Beijing and Moscow did vote in favor of unprecedented UN sanctions against North Korea, a step the president and his national security advisor have since downplayed, to the apparent chagrin of the State Department.
Are the sanctions a big deal, or are they not a big deal?
Look,
because I've heard two really different things.
I think the sanctions, and I'm not going to go against the president, but I think the sanctions are significant.
Allies have been confused at times over what this administration values more, collaboration or going it alone. Trump's America First doctrine reflected in the 3 themes the president is expected to touch on in his speech Tuesday.
First is to protect the American people. The second is to promote American prosperity. And the third is really to help promote accountability and sovereignty.
The U.S. footprint at the UN this year, much smaller than it's been in the past. Meetings overall, fewer, leaving allies skeptical of how much the U.S. will be engaged on key agenda items like democracy promotion, refugees, and the environment. And how a nationalistic leader of the free world will embrace this global entity now.
I personally think he slaps the right people, he hugs the right people, and he comes out with U.S. being very strong in the end.
Among the big questions raised here by some of those mixed messages are, is the U.S. truly out of the Paris climate deal or not? Is the U.S. leaving the Iran nuclear deal? And looking ahead to the president's schedule today, on his first day, he will chair a session on reforming the UN, something he's pushed for to try to make it more efficient. He'll also be meeting with leaders of Israel, France, and tonight, Latin America. Allison and John.
Okay, Michelle, thank you for that preview. Let's bring in our political panel to discuss it. We have editor-at-large at Time Magazine and president of Eurasia Group, Ian Bremmer, and CNN political analyst David Gregory. David, what do we expect? Is there any way to tell what to expect from President Trump this week at the UN?
Well, just a few minutes ago on our air, Tony Blair was saying there is confusion and there is anxiety. And I think that's the principal aim here, is to try to clear some of that up. This is now President Trump on the world stage, a major international institution, one that he's been critical of. It is not unusual to have a new president to be looked at askance by the international community. and this president even more. He's also been unpredictable. We've seen that in domestic affairs just in the past couple of weeks, how he's worked with Democrats. Now there's some signaling that maybe he will find a way back in to the Paris Climate Accords. And there is a looming crisis over North Korea, where we're going to see the president privately and publicly ramp up pressure on North Korea, but also put pressure on, namely China, to play a bigger role to diffuse this growing nuclear threat from North Korea. So I think this is really going to be about tone. It's going to be about style, as people are still trying to take Trump's measure to gauge what we've seen so far versus where he may be heading.
Tone and style. And the appetizer to the speech this week is this statement that he made on Twitter about Kim Jong-un, Ian, calling him Rocket Man. Right here. I spoke with President Moon of South Korea last night, asked him how Rocket Man is doing. Long gas lines forming in North Korea, too bad. You liked Rocket Man.
Sure. It's clever. It's been used before. The Japanese used to call Kim Jong-il Rocket Monster. His dad. I mean, Trump's good at coming up with cute nicknames that everyone talks about, and here we are talking about it. Let's face it, the North Koreans are vastly better at propaganda than we are, and they say they're going to destroy us, and they're going to sink Japan, and they're going to leave nothing but ashes. I think he can handle a tweet that's going to only put Kim Jong-un more in the news. But to get back to David's point, look, what's interesting about Trump at the United Nations, when Trump gets insecure, he goes to his base. When he thinks the media is going badly, he goes to his base. On the international stage, he has no base. Even American allies privately look at Trump and say, who the hell is this guy? We don't trust him. We don't know about our relationship anymore. He'll be fine on the big stage, the UN General Assembly, because the speech is written for him. He reads speech well. The more formal it is, the fine. But in all of these off-camera moments, the one-on-ones with all of these heads of state, and then their delegations are going to be talking to each other, it's going to leak. You remember these conversations with the Australian Prime Minister, the Philippine President, all of that? That's where we've gotten some of the most salacious headlines, because their staffs look at Trump and say, who the hell is this bozo? And what's going to happen this week is you're going to get a lot of that, because they don't like him, they don't trust him, and offline, off camera, they say a lot of really snarky things.
That's interesting, right, David? I mean, because these meet and greets have been described as like speed dating on steroids. But if these conversations tend to be more provocative or even just less scripted, that'll be interesting to listen to.
Right, and I think the other side of that, and I'd be curious for Ian's take, is there is an opportunity to impress with a more strategic approach to North Korea. I do maintain, despite tweets about Rocket Man and some of the other things we've seen from the president, if you look at what he's actually done, what his national security team has actually done, it is to treat this seriously. It is to move forward both in the United Nations and dealing one-on-one with China to try to ramp up pressure there. This is not someone who's loosely talking about going to war. They've talked about all options on the table, but they're clearly positioning themselves to try to get into some kind of conversation with the North, some kind of dialogue, while really putting pressure on China, which, after all, has to be the most concerned not only about the potential for war, but also what would flow from that, which would be more U.S. influence in that part of the world, particularly in a potentially unified Korea. So these are things that China both fears and has some control over.
Ian, is there a coherent North Korea policy right now?
I think that the actual implementation of policy is pretty coherent. Let's keep in mind that the North Koreans, after the Americans made it pretty rough and credible that you come towards Guam, we're really going to hit you back, Kim Jong-un backed off pretty quickly, right?
But define that policy. So that means that we set some sort of red line, which is Guam, I guess, and they take notice. I mean, is that how it's working right now?
A couple things. One, it means that we are going to consistently talk the military angle, that if this really falls apart, we're running out of time, this isn't going to last through the next administration, whoever that is, you can't kick the can anymore. So either you get enough sanctions, enough pressure on North Korea that we actually see them change their behavior, or there is a possibility that there's going to be a military attack. Now, I don't think that we would engage militarily, but the credible questioning of the Chinese and North Koreans, the strategy is we'll bring them to the table. And at least on the Security Council, we've now seen 15-0 votes, which means not just our allies, but the Russians and the Chinese upping the ante and doing things that we've not seen under Obama, under Clinton, under Bush, in terms of squeezing the North Koreans. Now, let's see if they really execute on that, and let's see how the North Koreans respond. Nikki Haley deserves credit in pushing the Chinese, cajoling, engaging, and berating to get them all around the table and moving. Now, Kim Jong-un deserves more credit in ultimately ensuring that that's the reason that this is all coming together. But I think you have to say she's doing a pretty credible job.
Let me just add that if we remember even short-term history, going back to the Clinton administration, there was a negotiation with Kim's father that ultimately fell apart around a nuclear freeze. And, you know, I remember President Bush talking about how Iran would never go nuclear on his watch. The truth is they kept buying time on that. And ultimately, the Obama administration has done the same, buying another 14 years that these deals keep getting recertified. I have to think that any administration wants to buy as much time with North Korea as possible.
We'll have to wait and see. Ian, I want to ask you about a couple other things. The Paris climate deal, there was some talk this weekend the administration might be willing to renegotiate or stay in it. They say, no, there's no change in our policy. Do you think there's any possibility for a change in the policy?
Not at this point, no. I think that they already took the political hits. We already know that there are, I think, 9 states that have said that they're going to be continue to commit to Paris climate goals. Over 300 cities have also said it, a whole bunch of corporations. I don't think that around the world governments are really concerned that the United States being out means that this whole thing is going to fall apart. But Trump gets to say, this is one of the things that I had promised during the campaign, and I'm going through on my commitment. I think there are people within his administration that are deeply unhappy about that. Some of them are leaking to the press. I'd be stunned if they actually did a flip on this.
And David, so curious about your thoughts on Paris as well as Iran nuclear deal. It sounds like the administration is rethinking some of the things that President Trump has threatened on that too.
Well, again, it's you know, how many crises do they want to take on at once? They don't want to unleash Iran to just resume its program. You know, at least the existing accord buys America and its allies more time to keep Iran in check. And you heard David Sanger from the Times saying last hour that, you know, the advice to the president is you can keep bashing Iran over this, just don't get all the way to the point of decertifying. My bigger question about climate policy and about the president's approach to the UN is one that I think is part of his domestic policy as well. The president has a base, as Ian said. He plays to that base when he feels insecure or under attack. But when he's attacked, it reminds him how much he dislikes being disliked and how legitimate he wants to be and appear on the world stage. And I think the opportunity to win, however the president defines that, and to be seen as a legitimate world leader is something that I think really appeals to him. And we've seen him start to make some compromises to position himself that way. And that's why I'm kind of eager to see how he approaches the UN and how much that will have changed from his campaign rhetoric.
Quickly?
I just say that, you know, national security is the one place where Trump seems to know that he doesn't know things. And that's a good thing. You remember on NATO when he said, NATO's obsolete, got to get rid of it. And then later on he comes back and he says, well, look, I was a real estate guy. I didn't know anything about NATO. He would never admit that level of lack of knowledge on trade, on tax, on health care. I think that's why you've seen him go to the generals who know things. And ultimately, I think that gives us a little more feeling of security that he's not going off the rails on some of those issues.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thanks for the great conversation
Thanks.
and the preview. We have to talk about other big news. Hurricane Maria. Yes, respondent and host of Reliable Sources, Brian Stelter, joins us now with the highlights. Brian, great to see you. Special Counsel Robert Mueller and his team now have their hands on Russia-linked ads that ran on Facebook during the 2016 election. Now, a bipartisan group of senators wants to dig even deeper. One of those is Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York. She is part of that effort, and she joins us now. Great to have you here in studio.
It's a pleasure.
So, what a travesty of what we're learning about with Facebook and these Russian troll farms that somehow were able to advertise on Facebook, and nobody was any the wiser, thinking that they were reading real retweets from real Americans and real information from Americans. But it wasn't, and it was all, I mean, if what has leaked out is to be believed, you know, Russian troll farms behind it. What are you going to do about this?
So Senator Lindsey Graham and I have a bipartisan bill to do a deep dive, a 9/11 style commission that will look into how are we hacked, what were our cyber vulnerabilities, what are our cyber vulnerabilities today, and what can we do to prevent another type of interference in the 2018 election.
And what do you want Facebook and social media to do? I mean, if they're
they're not above the law, and it is illegal for foreign countries to undermine or participate in our elections. So buying those Facebook ads is illegal. So what we need is more disclosure and more accountability, more transparency. But they have a role to play, and we need to have much better accountability by the next election.
So you've not been impressed with their transparency thus far?
It's not adequate because they are responsible for people who buy their sites, who use their platform, and if they're breaking the law, there has to be some level of participation. So we are going to make sure that this deep dive reveals any vulnerabilities we have. We also have questions about were voting machines somehow interfered with.
Do you think they were? Because we've not seen evidence of that.
I've just heard some reports that there might have been efforts to decommission or somehow undermine different voting machines in different states, causing lines, causing people to not vote, particular states being targeted. So these are things that we need a full investigation of to see if there's any evidence of it, and then what evidence there is, and what can we do to protect ourselves next time.
Let's talk about another bit of bipartisanship that you're involved in, and that is you want to protect transgender military service members, particularly after what the president has just said in terms of a ban. So what are you going to do about that?
Well, these are men and women who are serving our country today, putting themselves in harm's way, risking their lives. No one should tell them they cannot serve based on their gender identity. And so I have a bipartisan bill with Senator McCain, Jack Reed ranking on the Dem side, along with Susan Collins, and Susan and I worked together to write the bill. To say if you are serving today, you are protected, you cannot be kicked out, and that you may re-enlist.
And what about future people who want to enlist?
So that's the question, and that's what Secretary Mattis is doing right now, is analyzing what he intends to do in the future. But while that's happening, we want to make sure no one can be kicked out, because again, this goes to our basic civil rights and civil liberties. If someone is willing to die for this country, you should not tell them they can't serve.
Another topic that I want to talk to you about, because you and I have both worked on this in the past, and that's campus sexual assault. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos has said publicly that she wants to kind of revisit the guidance from the Obama administration in terms of how universities should handle this widespread problem of campus sexual assault. And it sounded as though what she wanted to look at was how to better protect. One of the things that she wanted to look at was how to make the system work better, she says, and to protect the falsely accused. What do you think of that?
Well, I have a concern that she doesn't understand the dynamics of these cases very well. I don't want an innocent person getting in trouble or being accused any more than I want a guilty person going free. And so we want to have a system. So we have a bipartisan bill right now in the Senate, and if she really wants to fix the problem, she should support our bill. It's widely supported by Democrats and Republicans, and the most important part of our bill is to have an online survey that students get to fill out every 2 years to say, number one, is my campus safe? What's the climate like? Have I been assaulted? If so, have I reported? If not, why not? You will get a snapshot in time for every college campus in America to say, what's the campus like? If they report on these surveys, there was 35 assaults last year and not one has actually been reported, you know you have a problem with your reporting structure or people's confidence in the system you have. And our bill really creates protections both for the accused and the accuser. We want to make sure that every school is well trained to basically have a certification process to say you know what you're doing when you're doing and reviewing these cases. And then another point that law enforcement's developed is having one confidential advisor on every campus. So if you are a victim of sexual assault, you have someone to go to, and she or he can tell you, this is what it looks like if you report on campus. You can only receive accommodation. You can get your class schedule changed, you can get your dorm changed, but it's only accommodation, and best case scenario, your assailant is kicked out. If you go to criminal justice, that means jail time, that means going through a trial. And I'll tell you, when you tell a survivor, if this happens again to someone else or a third person, will you be willing to testify? Typically, she says yes. And then the advisor can say, well, then you should get your rape kit done today. Because if you want to preserve your ability to testify in the future, that has to be done. It's a reason to do those kinds of things that, you know, an 18-year-old girl on a college campus might not want to do otherwise. So that's the key, getting more cases to ultimately go to law enforcement, but giving guidance to that individual on the first day about what are your options. That usually results in more cases ultimately going to law enforcement.
Okay, next topic. There seems to be a lot of analysis about the 2016 election going on all sides still, though it's in our rearview mirror. But Hillary Clinton, as you know, has her new book out. So she's been talking a lot about what she thinks, what she blames for her loss. She was just on PBS this weekend, and she was asked about that infamous now tarmac meeting between then Attorney General Loretta Lynch and Bill Clinton. So let me play for you whether or not Hillary Clinton thinks that that was to some degree responsible for her loss. Listen to this.
To what extent did Loretta Lynch and President Clinton make a costly mistake?
Judy, I just don't buy that. I honestly reject that premise, partly because there's a chain of command in the Justice Department. The optics, were not good. I admit that. What really was costly, and what I believe was the proximate cause of my defeat, was his October 28th letter.
Of course, she's talking about James Comey there. Do you think that in terms of that tarmac meeting, it was just bad optics?
So my view of this is we're looking forward to the 2018 elections, and I'm grateful that Secretary Clinton ran for president. I'm grateful that she's written her book because it's important for women to be heard in all places and to be able to tell their story. But fundamentally for me, that election is about how she inspired millions of people across the globe to stand up for what they believe in, to fight your hardest, win or lose. And as a result, we have thousands of women running for office this cycle. Emily's List reported that there were typically 1,000 or 2,000 women wanting to be trained and run at this time in the cycle. We have 14,000. And so I'm grateful for what Secretary Clinton has done, and I think she's inspired millions. And so I'm focused on how can we win these seats in 2018, and how can we encourage more candidates to come forward to run and to provide that oversight and accountability over President Trump.
Who's the leader of the Democratic Party right now?
I think you have your congressional leaders, of course, but I think Senator Sanders is out there talking about things that has big ideas like Medicare for all. I think Elizabeth Warren's out there talking about a rigged system that we desperately need to fix for working families. And for each of us who are running for re-election, such as myself and 24 other Senate Democrats, we're in our states talking about our vision and what we want to change and how we want to make a difference and how we want to make the economy grow.
But are they the national leaders, as you see it, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren?
I think that's how they're perceived, and I think they're doing a great job in terms of speaking out on the issues that matter to most people. But you won't really have a national leader Democrat until you have a nominee. So between now and then, you're really focused on state by state, winning over voters, listening to voters, hearing why they were so distressed in the last election, why many of them chose to vote for a disruptor, someone who was going to blow up the system, as opposed to someone who might have spoke to their values and goals better. And so we have to listen a lot harder, and then we have to work a lot harder in getting things done, actually passing legislation like things that will help people, rewarding work in this country, having paid leave in this country, having a minimum wage that's a living wage, things that could actually help people's lives, and we have to get that done.
What are your thoughts personally on 2020?
I think there's going to be a huge interest in trying to bring our country in a different direction. I think some of the policies that have come under the Trump administration have been really harmful, whether it's attacking DACA kids, whether it's attacking transgender troops, whether it's not investing in infrastructure, not investing in the middle class.
Right, but these are all issues that you care about. Are you thinking about running in 2020?
I'm focused on 2018, so I'm focused on my re-election. I'd like to be a senator.
But at some point, is that in your future?
Well, I'm focused on being a senator, so that's all I'm doing right now. And I think
if there were a void or they're a cash crop,